The crisis years. Why did tensions between the superpowers increase between 1957 and 1962? Arguably, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, humanity came closest to the apocalypse. We brushed very close to having a nuclear war. The reason why we brushed so close to the Cuban brink must be understood relative to a broader international context. So the crisis years idea, kind of a thesis by Hershberg, a Cold War historian, is to examine the diplomacy of brinkmanship, particularly adopted by Comrade Khrushchev, in which he used nuclear weapons or atomic diplomacy to achieve maximal diplomatic leverage for Soviet foreign policy objectives around the world. Now, when you play the nuclear game, obviously you're really raising the stakes. So you're providing a lot of pressure to achieve your interests in the UN, the Congo, or Cuba, or the Taiwan Straits. But the consequence of going to the brink of nuclear war also had a very obvious downside. If you use this so often, you are in fact creating conditions where nuclear weapon use is becoming more normalized and more likely to be used, even if that is not your intention. The second downside is when you bring, the superpowers to the very brink, you may lose control over the situation so that a small accident or an unintended event could actually throw you into a nuclear conflict. And we will see that for sure in the 13 days of October. So there's various events that constitute the crisis years. Without going into detail of all of them here, I think what we can see from 1957 to 1962 is a clear trajectory of escalation. The trust between the superpowers eroded. The frequency with which nuclear threats were made, particularly by Khrushchev, created conditions where the Americans started to worry about Khrushchev's sanity. They started to believe that his motives were opaque. They started to wonder if it wasn't just bluffing, but that if the Soviet Union was in some ways in pursuit of a first strike policy to attack the United States. So the climate itself, the various events, the rising tensions between the superpower raised the stakes that a future confrontation, which would ultimately be Cuba, might end up being decisive. And it eroded the barriers that had been set into place relative to the use of nuclear weapons as only one of last resort. This was certainly the policy of the Eisenhower administration and the New Look doctrine. So if we want to understand the crisis years, probably the starting point for this has to be Khrushchev. Who was this man? What was the context in which he operated? What was his personality? What was his psychology or thinking, the rationale behind his various foreign policies from 1956 to 1962. Now, Khrushchev won the succession battle after Stalin's death in 1953. Certainly in 1953, neither the Soviet people or communist allies or his rivals would have anticipated that Khrushchev would win the succession battle, but he outmaneuvered them all. It was a gradual process by which he consolidated his authority. Between 56 and 57, he really put his final stamp on the regime and emerged as Stalin's successor. Molotov was sent off to retirement in 1957, and that really was, the last of the old Stalinists. Khrushchev essentially had control over the state. However, he never had the same amount of authority that Stalin did. He didn't have the same amount of respect or the fear among his opponents. In fact, he didn't want to rule through fear. So one of his big policies was the thaw, which was in essence trying to set a new course for the Soviet state. And this had domestic and international dimensions. Relative to Soviet citizens, it was trying to establish a new contract, a new relationship between the party and the people, with the party, really devoted on building socialism. Relative to the Cold War, the Soviet Union tried to adopt a policy of peaceful coexistence, which was in essence an offer to end the Cold War and to diminish the risk of nuclear weapons. But the Eisenhower administrations did not respond to this offer to de-escalate the Cold War. They viewed peaceful coexistence as a peace offensive. In other words, the Soviet Union was trying to end the Cold War because they were losing it and falling behind, and that they had cynical motives. In particular, they were trying to prevent Germany from ascending into NATO. But the U.S. rejection of peaceful coexistence angered Khrushchev, and also resolved in his mind the idea of bluffing in the sense that he often threatened nuclear war. He often exaggerated the number of Soviet ICBMs and the number of Soviet warheads. And he used nuclear weapons as leverage in a way to hide Soviet weakness and to punish the United States for not accepting his offer to end the Cold War. Now, Khrushchev also had, kind of an irascible personality. He displayed this at various times during the Congo crisis, the Second Berlin crisis. Probably for Soviet citizens, Khrushchev had a sort of folksy charm, but for many international diplomats, Soviets' behavior, his disruptive behavior during the UN when he tried to remove Dag Hammarskjöld, in a way raised concern if Khrushchev had a screw loose. And this was certainly reinforced when he, in various times, used the threat of nuclear war to gain diplomatic leverage. Probably the first example of this was during the Suez Crisis, where he threatened Britain and France with, lobbing nuclear missiles. But it was a tactic to which he returned in various times, including the Second Berlin Crisis in 1962, right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, from the eyes of the West, Western leaders, also the Western public, it no longer seemed that nuclear weapons were off the table, that they were a strategic weapon that would only be used in a last resort. In looking at Khrushchev and his discourse, it seemed that he was hell-bent on launching the Cold War, and he was willing to use nuclear weapons in order to gain diplomatic advantage. Now, I can't go into an exhaustive, history of international relations from 57 to 62, but I do want to highlight a few events to give you a sense for how the superpower trust was eroding over time. So I think, the shift in Khrushchev's policy from seeking reconciliation and to de-escalate the Cold War to escalation, bluffing, and atomic diplomacy was really the Sputnik event. Now, this was obviously a triumph for Soviet science in the sense that they were the first to put an object into outer space. Now, the fact they were first was perceived to be significant, but the Americans could have done it before. For various reasons, they didn't, because they didn't see it as a race at that particular time. On the other hand, it was also clear that Soviet rocket scientists, or better said, the Nazi scientists that they had managed to gather, were probably in general ahead of the United States in 1956, 1957. Although the United States caught up and surpassed them relatively quickly. The reason that Sputnik really kind of raised American fears about nuclear war is the way that this was unveiled. It wasn't secret. There was this press conference. Khrushchev unveiled it, and it was kind of a surprise. And it really highlighted the fact for the first time that the United States was really vulnerable to nuclear attack. It's not to say that Soviet bombers couldn't have come across the Arctic and bombed American cities, but ICBMs were a much better delivery method. They really couldn't be intercepted, whereas the slow Soviet bombers could have been. So what it really meant is that for the first time in the Cold War, there was kind of a balance in terms of nuclear terror, where Americans realized that even though the Soviet Union only had a few ICBMs, they would quickly be able to build more, and this meant that now Americans were vulnerable to nuclear weapons as well. It wasn't just something that the Americans had to hold over the Soviet Union's head. Another event that created tension was the Taiwan Straits crisis. Now, this was actually Mao's policy, and he didn't inform Khrushchev. Khrushchev kind of backed him up by saying, to the Americans, stand down, or else, we're going to get involved. We're there. Mao had, for a long time, the idea of ending the Civil War, reconquering Formosa, bringing down Chiang Kai-shek and his government, and ending once and for all Chiang Kai-shek's as a rival to him. And also, of course, Chiang Kai-shek was sponsoring various guerrilla groups in mainland China. All this had really diminished by 1958. But the Taiwan Straits crisis was essentially Mao bombing Quemoy, which is an island very close to mainland China, but part of the state of Taiwan. So the Americans sent in the Pacific Fleet. It wasn't clear what was going on. It seemed like this could run into nuclear war, but gradually it was diffused. And even though it was diffused, it just did raise the sense that tensions between the superpowers were rising and the trust between them was eroding. Now, during the Congo crisis, Khrushchev was very upset about what happened to his ally Lumumba in the Congo. He felt that the United States and the Belgians had undermined Lumumba. They were responsible for his assassination. And he, in various ways, correctly surmised that the UN was acting in cahoots with the West rather than being neutral. The way that he reacted to this was trying to remove Doug Hammarskjöld, and he interrupted the proceedings by having his diplomats bang on the table. So in the West, this was viewed as, boy, who is this guy, Khrushchev? What's going on in his head? His visit to the United States, in which he had made many undiplomatic comments about American popular culture, also contributed to this feeling, this intensity and this fear. Who is this guy that has his finger on the nuclear button? And the second Berlin crisis is really linked to the Cuban Missile Crisis in various ways. Essentially, the trigger for this was that so many East Germans were fleeing the socialist paradise of the DDR that the state was on the brink of collapse. So, Honecker said, you got to do something about this, or we're going to collapse here. And Khrushchev tried to regulate the status of Berlin, because the fact of the matter was there was a gaping hole in the Iron Curtain. East Germans could flee, and they immediately became citizens in West Germany, and they had access to a better life. So they were hemorrhaging so many elite that they had to find a way to plug this hole in the Iron Curtain. So when Khrushchev said, we have to resolve this, according to the Potsdam Protocol, we have to get out of Berlin, We got to regularize and normalize its status. The West, Kennedy was not in any way incentivized to help Khrushchev out. It was great for the West to see everyone fleeing the socialist paradise and going to the West. So when Khrushchev found that the West didn't want to negotiate with him, he gave them an ultimatum. He threatened nuclear weapons if they didn't negotiate this. But the West called his bluff. He danced the tanks around Berlin. He tried to raise tensions. The West just decided to ignore him. And this frustrated Khrushchev, and eventually they resolved on building the Berlin Wall, essentially transforming East Berlin into a prison camp to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West. But the damage had been done. Now, essentially the use of nuclear weapons had become normalized in international relations. Americans were very pessimistic. A Pew poll said that the majority of Americans believed that nuclear war was very, very near and inevitable. So people were living in fear of nuclear weapons. And it's in this context that we need to understand the American perceptions about the Cuban Revolution. So relative to the Cuban Revolution, I can't go into excruciating detail, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of it. Essentially, Cuba had been an American colony. It had a certain degree of sovereignty, but it was essentially a banana republic. A banana republic means that although its government was elected by its own people, in fact, American business interests were really the voices behind the throne that controlled the country. And if the country would deviate too much in terms of challenging American financial interests, such a government would be at very large risk of being overthrown. So Cuba had developed as an American formal colony before getting its independence. There had been a significant amount of American investment in its industrial base. It was largely a commodity economy. Its principal exports were sugar and tobacco. So the American investors owned a considerable amount of the export economy, and the leading market for it was, of course, the United States, which was just 60 miles away from the Florida Keys. Now, Batista had seized power and had largely usurped the democratic government to become essentially a dictator who ruled through extra-legal means. As a result of a regime that was not only despotic, but also increasingly corrupt and not giving ordinary Cubans a voice in their government, and also not allowing the peasants to benefit from the wealth generated from the economy. So opposition against Batista was rising in all quarters of society. Now, it is in this context that a young lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro became a revolutionary. His goal was to overthrow the Batista regime and to create a new government of social justice. And I'm talking about social justice in the broadest terms, exactly what his motives were, whether he was a Marxist, what it meant for American business owners. All this was not fully defined, especially early in his career. But it didn't seem that Castro had a long career ahead of him, because in his first major revolutionary act, an attack on the police station, things went horribly wrong. He had the ignominy of being shot in the ass and arrested and put on trial. Now, he recovered in the sense that he used his trial, as many revolutionary leaders in the past, as essentially a platform for articulating his noble revolution, and got a lot of acclaim and recognition in Cuba, being an obscure lawyer and young lawyer in Havana, and now being this revolutionary with a dream that really resonated with many disaffected people in Cuba. So Batista didn't really dare to execute him. Instead, he thought he'd send him into exile to Mexico City and then, wash his hands from him. But Fidel Castro was not dissuaded. In fact, in Mexico City, he ran into a Marxist revolutionary, an Argentine doctor by the name of Ernesto Guevara, famously known as Che. And almost immediately they begin the business of planning a second stage of the revolution. They're going to contract this yacht, the Grama, and the plan is to go into Cuba and inspire an armed rebellion against the unpopular Batista regime. But again, it doesn't seem very promising because they're spotted before they make landfall. They're soon intercepted, and most of the merry band of 90 revolutionaries is either arrested or killed. Che Guevara is also shot up. He has a brush with death. The survivors retreat into kind of desolate Sierra Maestra mountains, where they engage in kind of petty sabotage. They cut telephone wires, they attack military installations. They're kind of more of a nuisance than a real problem for Batista. The main problem for Batista is essentially the ineptness of his regime, the problems in the economy. So many people are disillusioned, and this kind of galvanizes in 1957 in a kind of a general uprising. Students and liberals in Havana are really the leaders of this. They storm the presidential palace. They make it all the way into the palace. They kind of go up the staircase before they're shot down. And the coup fails, and the result of this is that Batista becomes more brutal than ever, and most of the democratic opposition is forced to flee Havana, and many of them have no choice but to go into the mountains and join Fidel Castro, who is essentially the only resistance that's left standing. However, the fact that Batista has to resort to violence and force and brutality only makes his regime more unpopular and therefore more fragile. And we can see this in the famous 1958 Battle of Santa Clara. Che Guevara is leading essentially a raid on Cuba's second largest city, kind of in the interior here. And what happens is that when Batista sends in the army, they pretty much desert. They've got tanks and heavy weapons. They just abandon them and flee for their lives. So the effect is that a raid becomes the capture of Cuba's second largest city. And this essentially cuts Cuba in half and essentially seals the end of the Batista regime. So there's a New Year's Day party in Havana. Batista celebrates, then he grabs a plane for Miami and never comes back. So Batista is gone. His regime, his corrupt allies in the business class are kind of left holding the bag. Fidel Castro has won. He comes down from the mountains in triumph into the city of Havana, and he establishes the regime he's always talked about. He's going to usher in a Cuban Revolution. And what is this Cuban Revolution? It's not clear at first. It's clear that the Batista regime is over. There's going to be a regime of social justice, but other than that, it's not really quite clear what Castro pretends to do. But immediately it's clear that the old regime is going to be punished. So there's revolutionary trials, which come very far from Western standards of de jure justice. People are accused, and then they are sentenced, and then they are shot, and it's sending a very clear message. This is going to be a change, and the people that were supporting Batista are going to be punished. They're going to have their property confiscated. They might lose their lives, and there's going to be a new sheriff in town, and the focus is going to be on the Cuban people. But Cuba was a colonial state, and there was a lot of foreign business interests that owned the majority of the economy. Castro was careful. He understood, American sensitivities. He didn't want to move too fast. He was fighting an internal enemy, and he couldn't tackle, external enemies at the same time. So he moved relatively slowly in terms of putting in the landmark legislation that's going to bring about the society of social justice. But one important installment in that, in the first year, was the Agrarian Reform Law. And simply what this meant is that property would be bought out by the state and given to essentially landless peasants. So it's land distribution. It's been done before. It's obviously not a measure that's very popular with landowners who have their businesses or land confiscated and often feel that the money that they are given by the state for this land is not adequate to what its real value is, although it's often what they declared on their own tax forms, and they paid taxes on that particular value. Now, this did, concern the United States, but, Castro in various ways tried to reassure them and say, I'm not a communist. This is the Cuban Revolution. This is nationalist. I'm not allied to the Soviet Union. We just have to do this to, set the injustices right and, create a, more prosperous Cuba that's going to benefit ordinary Cubans. But by August 6, 1960, he goes considerably further. He's more, he's punished the Batista regime. He's very solidly in charge. Now he goes into the much larger step of nationalizing, therefore confiscating, expropriating the large businesses. So, the tobacco and sugar plantations owned by American businesses. His argument, like any revolutionary leader, is, this is Cuban property. This is Cuban labor. The wealth of Cuba should serve the Cuban people, not foreign investors. So we're going to take over these businesses and make sure that these benefit the state. The state's going to use this for hospitals and schools, and we're going to improve Cuban living standards because we've been a colony of the United States, and our land and labor has benefited foreign investors, and now this is going to change. But, for the Americans, this was a red line. This essentially meant that he was a communist. He didn't respect property rights. It meant that, if he was communist, he must be wanting to go in the communist bloc. This was a threat to the American influence in Central America. What's going to stop, peasants in El Salvador, Nicaragua from doing the same thing? So, the Cuban Revolution now had become a multi-dimensional threat to American dominance in Latin America, American business interests, and potentially a security threat in the sense that Cuba could become a beachhead, the only place where the Soviet Union had a formal military presence inside Latin America. Now, again, Castro tried to reassure. He said, I'm not allied with the Soviet Union. This is the Cuban Revolution. I'm not a Marxist. Of course, his brother Raul, Che Guevara were obviously Marxists, so these arguments were much less convincing after Castro had nationalized American businesses. Now, we also need to understand how America looked at Cuba, which wasn't necessarily rational from a particularly objective point of view. But in general, Americans looked at the Western Hemisphere as kind of their backyard. And this went back all the way to the Monroe Doctrine, when it was more of an idea than, Americans didn't really have the power to enforce it. But in the 1870s, or after 1870, when the United States began to industrialize and needed more raw materials, American influence, particularly in Central America, dramatically increased. Mexico was probably the leading place for American investors, but Cuba and many areas of Central America were also secondary areas of American business investment. So Central America developed under the benefit of American capital, but also with the downside of it in the sense that the wealth of the country was going to foreign investors rather than to the domestic. Now, Castro had tried to reassure the United States, but they were always a little bit wary of him because many of the ideas that he articulated, social justice is one thing, but nationalization, that was a red line. And essentially, once he had nationalized the American businesses, the American administration made the decision to go towards regime change. And this included assassination attempts. They did over 600 assassination attempts in various times during the 1960s. But when this wasn't really effective, they decided on option B, which was a covert subversion. This is essentially the playbook they'd used in Guatemala. They took Cuban exiles, people loyal to Batista. They trained them in an army in Honduras. They gave them amphibious craft. The idea is they would land in Cuba. And Castro's regime was so unpopular that simply the act of showing up and challenging the Castro regime would lead to its implosion, and people would re-embrace Batista allies and somehow embrace American democracy and American domination. Of course, none of this was in any way realistic. The whole plan was flawed at a very deep level and really didn't make logical sense. There's no sense to me that this could ever have worked. But the one very serious outcome of the flawed or failed Bay of Pigs invasion, because they landed and they had no popular support, so the Cuban army just surrounded them at the beaches and basically pummeled them until they surrendered, was that Castro now understood that he didn't have to play nice in terms of being a communist. He now became a Marxist. He probably already was Marxist. At least he was Marxist sympathizing. So now he identified as a Marxist, and more importantly, he realized the only way that the Cuban Revolution could survive is that he needed to have Soviet protection. The Americans were determined to get rid of him, and it was the only way that he could do it. Now, this was a difficult choice in the sense that, if he became a Soviet ally, it's changing, one master for another, and he didn't want to become a client state. He was in some way tainting the Cuban Revolution. He could now not claim that this was an indigenous movement. He'd have more difficulty appealing to peasants in Bolivia and say, follow the Cuban Revolution, because now it seemed like a foreign takeover, and this would, rattle the local elites. On the other hand, Castro was also, in a way, unthrottled. In his Havana Declaration, he gives this kind of elegant speech where he really deconstructs U.S. foreign policy and the hypocrisy behind it. He argues, you've always said that the United States is somehow a paladin for freedom, but if you look at the actual history of Latin America, what do you see? Whenever you have Cuban Revolution-like events where ordinary peasants try to better themselves and take control of their own land, the Americans send in their Marines and reestablish this oppressive colonial regime. So the Americans are not in any way the standard bearers for freedom. They are, in a sense, a neo-colonial power that acts in the interest of global capital to the detriment of Latin American peasants. So he's really casting it in a way that's going to resonate with many disaffected peasants throughout Latin America. And this really raises the stakes for the United States. If the Cuban Revolution survives, there's many disaffected peasants throughout Latin America that might be tempted to follow his example. This could lead to a domino effect where the United States' interest in Latin America, its power, its influence would erode, and of course it would provide this entryway for the Soviet Union into the region. So there's several, I think, three main points we need to understand about the Cuban Revolution. I went over it very quickly. The first is that although most people in Cuba were definitely not Marxist or even communists, Castro's message, the big message of the Cuban Revolution, a regime of social justice, resonated with them. They had lived under Batista. They saw Batista as an American puppet. They were proud. They saw national independence as being free from these influences. So, for all of those reasons, Castro was able to build a strong base of support, but not because he was a Marxist, but because he was a populist, because he was a reformer, because his regime delivered, at least in its early years, material progress to Cubans. It gave them land, it gave them health care. Things weren't perfect, but conditions improved, and as a result, he had managed to persuade the majority of Cubans to support his regime and his revolution. And this is also why when the American Batista cronies arrived at the Bay of Pigs, there was really no big uprising as the Americans anticipated. Now, the other thing is, Castro had tried to avoid the Cold War for various reasons I explained in the last slide. But he also came to the realization that the Americans were so dead set to his regime that the only way that his regime and the revolution could survive was to seek protection from the United States' international rival, Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was only too happy to back him up in this, because it provided really the first real base that the Soviet Union had in Latin America. The Soviet economy was very weak. They didn't really trade with Latin America. They didn't have embassies in a lot of countries in Central America. So the Cuban Revolution, and one of the most charismatic revolutionaries of the 1960s, had chosen, to go into the socialist camp. This was a coup for him in the global Cold War and this competition to win the hearts and minds of, third world states. So if we have to draw a few conclusions, I guess, one of the conclusions we could draw is that the crisis years were definitely linked to Khrushchev's policies and personality in various ways, his anger and frustration that the Americans essentially rejected what he saw to be his sincere offer for peaceful coexistence. So this led him to the dark side. You want to not accept it? Well, then I'll make you pay for the Cold War. I'll threaten you. I'll build nuclear weapons. I'll build rockets. I'll bring the pressure on you. And in various tussles across the global sphere, which was very unstable because of decolonization, he often used atomic diplomacy, the threat of nuclear violence, in a way to put leverage on the Americans or the colonial powers to adhere to what he wanted in those particular areas. So the result was, from 1956 to 1962, the relationship between the superpowers deteriorated. The discourse about using nuclear weapons became more normalized. And this raised the risk that any future confrontation might escalate to nuclear war. And this is exactly what happened in Cuba. Cuba can't be understood in isolation. We have to understand this. The crisis years, how this eroding trust contributed to how they perceived Cuba as critical, both superpowers. And it also, of course, is related to Castro's motive in the Cuban Revolution. Castro decided to go to the Soviet camp because he believed, and I think he correctly concluded, that the Cuban Revolution could not survive if he did not seek Soviet assistance. So as we'll see in the next slide, what Khrushchev did is he not only provided Khrushchev critical assistance, he also decided to bring nuclear weapons to the island, which is what triggers the 13 days of October.